As any engineer will tell you, you begin the design process with a specification of the task. You're not just making, say, a computer chip, but you are making one that has to be able to do so and so many calculations of the right kind per second. It mustn't cost more than people will be willing to pay to use it. It must make as few errors as possible if its electric supply is stable within certain parameters, and so on. Once you have a prototype up and running, you can see what its capacities are, how error prone it is, and then figure out what it will cost to make many of them. How many? Well, that depends on an estimate of how many people can afford the machines it will be installed in and will prefer them to other machines with other specifications. When people say that philosophers have been doing conceptual engineering all along, I think this misunderstands the importance of the role of the design specification. Peter Strawson, in endorsing the interest of what he called revisionary metaphysics, which was not what he was doing himself, he thought he was doing descriptive metaphysics, said, descriptive metaphysics is concerned to describe the actual structure of our thought about the world. Revisionary metaphysics is concerned to produce a better structure. Well, Uriel Kriegel responded more recently, and reasonably enough. Presumably what makes the structure better, however, is precisely that it captures the structure the world really has. But reasonable as this is, I think it's not right. For Kriegel is assuming that the design specification of the revisionary task is to develop concepts that more exactly represent the structure of the world. Now, I have difficulties with the idea that the world has a structure. Like Ramsey, following Wittgenstein, I'm inclined to think that the world is the totality of facts, not of things. But that's not my objection here. My objection is that it's always worth asking, better for what? And not presuming that correspondence with reality is the only possible answer. This is the main reason that philosophers have mostly not been doing conceptual engineering. They haven't usually had a well worked out answer to the question, better for what? But quite often, if they are assuming one, it is Kriegel's answer. That is why he was entitled to write presumably. That is indeed what many have presumed. Why does this matter? Well, once you think about this design specification question, you can see that, like the engineer designing a computer chip, conceptual engineers have to think about what people are going to do with the thing they are designing or redesigning. From now on, I won't keep saying or redesigning, but in practice, much of the conceptual engineering that is going on now is redesign, as my case study will suggest. In this case, the object that one's designing is a concept, a way of thinking about and representing and talking about the world. And in practice, to do that, you're going to propose a new way of using some words. That places constraints on what you are doing that have nothing to do with whether the concepts in question, the words in use, will represent the world accurately. Some constraints can appear trivial. If you're proposing to use an old word, say, you should think about how hard it will be to get people to forget the ways they used to use it. If you're proposing a new word, it should echo or reinforce the old ways of using, it shouldn't echo or reinforce the old ways of using words that you are hoping to replace. It will help if the word trips off the tongue. And if possible, it should evoke ideas that are useful in the vicinity of the ones you are developing. If you think these considerations trivial, you are, I suspect, not seriously committed to bringing about conceptual change. Still, that will not matter if someone else is willing to take up your ideas and do the work of shaping them for actual introduction into the world. It may be that the right people to think about that are not the conceptual engineers, but as it were, the production managers of the process. So there's plenty of work to get from design specification, and it cannot usually be done by a single person. There are usually many possible solutions to a design challenge because first, the aims are only vaguely specified, and second, there are all kinds of desiderata, each of which can be satisfied to a greater or lesser degree. And so third, it's unlikely that one solution is best with respect to all the constraints, and there's no agreement on how to create a single overarching measure of goodness. other design constraints are more substantial. And for those of you who read the abstract, we're now entering part 2. Other design constraints are more substantial. Having a concept expressed in a natural language is having a disposition to use a word for certain purposes. So getting a new concept into place in a language is a matter of getting people to do something new. Of course, getting them to do something new will be getting them to think in new ways too. That's a truth that fits with Wittgenstein's suggestion that we can sometimes answer the question, what does that mean, by showing how a word is used. As he said in the investigations, for a large class of cases, though not for all, in which we employ the word meaning, it can be defined thus. The meaning of a word is its use in the language. Once you've set your aim to design a concept that will help achieve such and such ends, it's necessary, if you're actually to achieve them, that, like the engineer, you make sure that your new concept can actually be put to use. And since what is involved is changing the behavior of large numbers of people in a coordinated way, what corresponds to the production process is in effect a movement for social change. That is true even if the conceptual reengineering is of a concept like gene, and your aim is not to change social relations, but to change the way people think about the bodies of organisms. Final preliminary thought. Usually, when you introduce a new concept, X, you do so not by introducing a single thought of the form an X is an A that F's and G's, where Y, F, and G are concepts already available, but rather by introducing a set of connected thoughts, a little theory, if you like. This is a point that Frank Ramsey brilliantly elucidated in his little essay on theories. Conceptual innovation, then, is often a matter of introducing not one idea, but many connected ideas. You're probably familiar with the idea of a Ramsey sentence of a theory. It's what you get when you conjoin the theory's major claims, take out a number of terms and replace them with variables, writing for each variable X, a quantifier. There exists an X such that in front of the result. That you can do this reminds us that you, as Ramsey intended this notion to allow us, that you can introduce a set of terms, a new bit of a language, in one fell swoop. You can do it. You don't need to be introducing just one concept at a time. So consider, by way of example, a very tidied up and unhistorical version of what was involved in grasping Mendels' concept of a gene. There were all these new ideas. Certain aspects of the phenotype of an organism are determined by its genes. Let's call these the genetically determined characteristics. The genes come in various types called alleles, which differ in the consequences that their presence makes to the genetically determined characteristics. Each of these genetically determined characteristics may exist in different forms, different colors of petals, for example, in the case of Mendel's experiments with peas, or the textures of the stem. Genetically determined characteristics are produced by pairs of alleles of the gene that corresponds to them. Every organism gets 2 alleles of each gene, one from each parent. If an organism gets identical alleles from each of its parents, it's homozygous with that allele, otherwise it's heterozygous, and so on. I won't go through all this list, but the point is that you can introduce all these concepts, as it were, at once, by way of a Ramsey sentence in which you delete those words in red and replace them with variables. And in this is a theory because it not only introduces terms, but it also introduces laws, the laws of segregation and assortment of genes. So if you write a Ramsey sentence of all this, with the new words gene, allele, genotype, phenotype, dominance, recessive, and so on, replaced by variables, and you get what was involved in grasping these new concepts, and you can see that to get what was going on, in some sense, you had to grasp them all at once. Of course, the law of assortment, when 2 different genes separate to form gametes and join together to form the new genotype, they do so independently. The law of assortment is actually false of genes on the same chromosome, but Mendel didn't know about chromosomes. So a conceptual alteration had to occur when chromosomes were discovered by Morgan. And that one was motivated solely by the idea to save the phenomena. It was a conceptual innovation guided by Kriegel's aim of more accurately capturing something that you might, I suppose, loosely call the structure of the world. But as we'll see, there are lots of other reasons for reshaping our concepts. Now, a fundamental thought in this area is what Ramsey saw as the central insight of pragmatism, that beliefs are states on which we act, or as he more cumbrously put it, the essence of pragmatism I take to be this, that the meaning of a sentence is to be defined by reference to the actions to which asserting it would lead, or more vaguely still, by its possible causes and effects. So action is one of the central things that beliefs are for, and to be good for guiding our actions, they must be good for guiding creatures like us. We have many limitations of memory, of computational capacity, of perceptual sensitivity, that need to be considered in designing concepts that we can actually use. That is why we have to make extensive use of idealizations. When we introduce new concepts in the sort of way I suggested for Mendels gene theory, precise correspondence to reality is only one of the many things that will matter. Indeed, all of our best theories are either very vague or clearly idealizations, defining idealizations, as Hans Weinger did in the philosophy of as if, as useful untruths. And as I argued in As If, Idealization and Ideals, a great deal becomes much clearer if you start with Weinger's great insight. Our current best physics only works because we make certain kludges in applying it, defining a kludge, as my free online dictionary does, as any system comprising several disparate parts or elements that have been poorly assembled or integrated together. Relativity and the quantum theory don't naturally go together. The natural formulations of each of them require axioms that are inconsistent. But even if you're just trying to produce a quantum theoretic treatment of an actual system, you need to know a bunch of ad hoc tricks to get something that makes a useful prediction. Anybody who's done any advanced physics knows this. Similarly, rational choice models in the social sciences require a model of rationality that's not just unrealized by any actual person, but actually unrealizable, since it requires logical omniscience, which is, I think, impossible. There are two theories of the chemical bond in current use, and nobody knows how to relate them to one another. Chemists use one sometimes, one at other times. Sometimes they try to say things in terms of both of them. Once you see that, you will see why our best chance of understanding the world must be to have a plurality of ways of thinking about it. The argument is simple. Trying to make all our theories consistent seems to make sense because the world, of course, is consistent. That was why the positivists had a program for the unification of the sciences by way of reduction. But that's too quick an argument. For if our best theories are not strictly speaking true, then the consistency of the world is not a reason for making theories consistent with each other. We need a multitude of pictures of the world, all not precisely true, and which untruths don't matter will depend on what we are using a particular theory for. Insisting upon the point that most of our useful ideas are strictly speaking false runs against a disciplinary habit of mind. For by and large, philosophers could be said to have a soft spot for truth. And that's an affection I share. So it's worth remembering that hardly anything we ordinarily say is clearly true. Take just the three sentences I just uttered by way of example. The first is what linguists call a generic, like tigers eat people. There are notorious difficulties with those. Who are the relevant philosophers? Who counts as a philosopher? How many of them must have this soft spot? What exactly makes sentences of the form X has a soft spot for Y true anyway? The second sentence inherits all these difficulties. What affection is articulated in the first sentence? As for the third sentence, what makes it true that hardly any X's are Y's? How many or what proportion of the things philosophers say must fail to be clearly true? What, for that matter, is it not to be clearly true? Nevertheless, I insist on these claims. Philosophers have a soft spot for truths. It's an affection I share, but hardly anything we say is clearly true. Once you see that falsehood is not itself a reason for rejecting a theory, we can recognize the usefulness of idealizations. And once we do that, we can see that it is always worth asking about a concept or a theory, useful for what? One reason that conceptual engineering is often redesigned depends on recognizing that much of the philosophy of language that I grew up with, debates about theories of meaning between realists like Davidson and anti-realists like Dummett, for example, began with a mistake. They thought that words and sentences had something called a meaning. Here is Dummett. A theory of meaning is a theory of understanding. That is, what a theory of meaning has to give an account of is what it is that someone knows when he knows the language. That is, when he knows the meaning of the expressions and sentences of the language. Here is Davidson. Stated simply, a theory of meaning for a language L shows, quote, how the meanings of sentences depend on the meanings of words if it contains a recursive definition of truth in L. What all this dodges is something Paul Grice adverted to in a famous paper on meaning before those two papers were written. At one point he wrote, X means timeless that so-and-so might at first shot be equated with some statement or disjunction of statements about what people, vague, intend, with qualifications about recognition, to effect by X. And the subscript NN there was for non-natural meaning, the kind of conventional meaning we see in natural languages. And the key word here is vague. Maybe you can sometimes pin down the specific concept that each speaker associates with a word. To decide that, you need an account of what a concept is. I myself doubt this in lots of cases because on any plausible account of concepts, a lot of our usage requires what Hilary Putnam called semantic deference. We mean to be referring to what the experts are referring to when we use words like gene or proton, or as Putnam pointed out, elm and beach. And deference is to a community, not an individual. And the individuals in the community may have different ideas, as they do about genes, for example. Even ignoring that problem, it just seems to me that as speakers develop an understanding of the language they grow into as children, there need be no precisely bounded singular concept, or whatever your favorite account is of concepts, that they all settle on. A lot of our usage has presuppositions we haven't noticed, and so how we'll go on in circumstances where they fail is just not fixed in advance. What does up mean in a rocket circling the Earth? Is a DNA sequence that provided the point of attachment for mRNA a gene? Furthermore, ask that question of Mendel. He doesn't know about mRNA and DNA, so he doesn't have an answer. Furthermore, while speakers in a community can regard each other as authorities on what words mean, so I can discover I've been misusing a word if most people correct my usage, there's no agreed process for settling things when usages diverge. So there is no answer in advance to the question how to settle different alignments of words to concepts. It's a social negotiation. It is a kind of politics. And because it can be very hard to predict how a proposed innovation might be taken up, what's needed is often a trial and error process in which proposals are made and we see what happens as they are and are not taken up. Okay, here's what I've argued so far. In part one, I argued that conceptual engineering requires a rough account of what the innovations in question are aimed at. Once we have the specifications, we have to ask what's necessary to achieve those aims. There are usually many solutions possible because A, the aims are only vaguely specified, and B, there are all kinds of desiderata, each of which can be satisfied to a greater or lesser degree. And it's both C, unlikely that one solution is best with respect to all the constraints, and D, not clear how to rank them. In part two, I argued that in conceptual engineering, the design task is to change linguistic and other behavior. Since what is involved is changing the behavior of large numbers of people in a coordinated way, what is going on is in effect a movement for social change. And because we're working on concepts, we need to be clear that they are best understood as embedded in theories, so they come in clusters, not one by one, and that most interesting concepts have very many conceptions, perhaps as many conceptions sometimes as users of a certain word. This will happen with the uptake of our newly engineered concept. It will be taken up in a variety of different ways, and you won't be able to anticipate them all in advance. Okay, this is part 3. I began thinking about the race concept seriously about 40 years ago. The reason was somewhat contingent. I had been hired with a joint appointment in the Department of African American and African Studies and the Department of Philosophy. And so at that point, no one, so far as I knew, had ever had a job at the intersection of those two fields. And so it was up to me to decide what interesting work lay at the intersection of philosophy and Black studies. The job was in America, a country I was arriving in for the first time to do this job. I knew, as any educated modern person would, that race relations in America had been troubled from the country's start, given the role of a race concept in the definition of legal enslavement. I had by then spent much of my childhood in Africa and much of my adulthood in Europe, my short adulthood since I was in my late 20s. And given that background, I was more familiar with the practices of race in Ghana and in Old England than with what I discovered were the somewhat different practices in New England, where I came to work. Like many educated Ghanaians, I was aware of the writings of Richard Wright and James Baldwin and W.B. Du Bois, and of course of the speeches of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And my father actually knew both Richard Wright and W.B. Du Bois. I think I met Wright as a child, but I unfortunately don't remember the occasion. I had a vague sense, as someone who started following the news in my teens in the 1960s of the American Civil Rights Movement, about how race was proving to be problematic in the United States. And I'd been taught something in my high school history classes about the role of racism in the genocidal projects of the Nazis. Finally, and this was another contingency, I had spent my first year at university doing medical sciences, since before I realized I could do philosophy in college, I'd been preparing to be a doctor. So I knew more biology than most of my contemporaries in philosophy classes. So I was somewhat surprised to discover that many Americans thought that race was a central biological concept. In fact, of course, in part in response to the Nazi abuses of science, there had been a couple of UNESCO statements on race that aimed to deny that the concept of race at use in social life belonged in proper scientific discourse. Looking into some of the intellectual history here, I learned that much of the work of modern cultural anthropology, beginning in the early 20th century with people like Boas, had been to displace an older way of thinking about human difference in biological terms with a new one rooted in notions of cultural difference. Mendelian genetics, which really begins in the 20th century when Morgan rediscovered and developed Mendels' hitherto largely ignored 19th century work, gave an account of human difference in individual terms and saw group differences as statistical rather than based in the racial essences of the 19th century. If I had had the concept of conceptual engineering, I would have said to myself something like this. Many Americans use the word race in ways that presuppose things that are inconsistent with the best science of our day. When it's used to refer to black and white and red and yellow and brown people, Negroes, Caucasians, American Indians, East and South Asians, or to distinguish Jewish people or Hispanics in the United States, it's picking out groups that are thought to have some deep and important biological properties in common, which they don't. Of course, there are real social facts captured by assigning people to these supposed racial groups, facts that mean that there are rough and ready sociological generalizations that distinguish them. Many generic statements. Blacks are poorer on average than whites. They're far more likely to have suffered significant disadvantage in virtue of being regarded as black. The same is true of American Indians, Native Americans, as some people prefer to say. Jews continue to suffer discrimination too, and it is not the result of their religion, since anti-Semitism is largely indifferent to people's actual religious beliefs and practices. Since the most salient fact about the race idea is that it plays a central role in communicating false beliefs, beliefs that are false by scientific standards, and in sustaining racial discrimination, surely we are better off without it. That doesn't mean we can or should ignore the reality of these sociological generalizations, but we don't need the race for those groups. We can talk instead about racialized groups or about racial identities. The design specification here is this admittedly vague one. Find a way to talk about the groups that are now called races that reduces both the intellectual and the moral costs of current usage. But I didn't have the concept of conceptual engineering. And so instead, in the absence of that idea, I wrote in 1985, the truth is that there are no races. There's nothing in the world that can do all we ask race to do for us. The evil that is done by the concept and by easy yet impossible assumptions as to its application. I urged then, in effect, that we stopped speaking of race because there were no social groups that met the conditions that people who spoke of races took to be central to their understanding of them. Now, it was unsurprising in retrospect, despite the care with which I thought I had developed this idea, that there were a variety of critical responses to racial eliminativism of this sort. From one direction, there were those who argued that abandoning the word race left you without a way to capture those sociological generalizations I mentioned. If races aren't real, how can there be obvious sociological truths about them? My response to this line of thought was first to withdraw the argument for eliminating the term, but to argue for a new understanding of it, following a proposal that W.B. Du Bois had made at the beginning of the 20th century, to treat race not as a biological, but as a social concept, and to speak of races as what came to be called socially constructed. Du Bois put this point here first in eliminativist terms, but he went on by saying we should speak of civilizations where we now speak of races. This is in 1911. But he went on to talk about races for the rest of his life, which went on until 1962, so it was a long life. Understanding the idea, however, in this new way, as something produced by social practices of treating people with certain purported ancestries or appearances in particular ways, and as bearers of cultural traditions, which was the point of speaking of civilizations. Now, I didn't share Du Bois's way of thinking about socially constructed races because I never thought of them as defined by socially transmitted cultural traditions in this way. This was the major burden of my first published paper about Du Bois. Du Bois thought you could identify Black people by Black culture. He thought that you could only identify Black culture. Sorry, Du Bois thought that you could identify Black people by Black culture. I thought that you could only identify Black people culture as the culture of Black people, and that therefore you had to have something other than culture to do the work of defining the group. But more important than this disagreement was the underlying agreement that we needed a sociocultural story about how the groups people called races were defined. But apropos of Du Bois, there was a different line of objection that would have come from him to much of what I was suggesting. Du Bois was the most intellectually significant of the founders of Pan-Africanism. This was a movement of solidarity among Black people, Negroes, as he would have called them. And despite the fact the word Africa's appearance in Pan-Africanism, the movement was essentially about bringing together people in Africa and her Atlantic diaspora in the Americas, and to a lesser extent in Europe. Now, this form of solidarity was a great positive force in resisting the two central effects of racism on Black people: colonial exploitation in Africa and racial oppression elsewhere. To abandon the very word race, some argued, was to abandon the possibility of building racial solidarity in resistance to racism. Here again, the language of conceptual engineering would have been useful. For without the design specification in mind, find ways of talking that enable anti-racist solidarity in the African diaspora, I could have defended my own proposals as defining a Black identity for this purpose, if I had had the idea of conceptual engineering. The word race, with its suggestions of a solidarity grounded in a natural unity rooted in a shared biology, was not helpful in the project of creating solidarity. That challenge was one I identified, despite lacking the concept of conceptual engineering, in the next phase of the development of my work. As I wrote in 1993, the problem, of course, is that group identity seems to work only, or at least to work best, when it's seen by its members as natural, as real. Pan-Africanism, Black solidarity, can be an important force with real political benefits, but it doesn't work without its attendant mystifications. Recognizing the constructedness of the history of identities has seemed to many incompatible with taking these new identities with the seriousness they have for those who invent, or as they would no doubt rather say, discover and possess them. In sum, the demands of agency seem always, in the real world of politics, to entail a misrecognition of its genesis. You cannot build alliances without mystifications and mythologies. So I argued in response to this challenge that the rejection of the old way of thinking about race was helpful rather than a hindrance. It allowed, for example, a distinction between two rather different projects. If there is, as I've suggested, hope too for the Pan-Africanism of an African diaspora, once it is released from bondage to racial ideologies, it is crucial that we recognize the independence, once quote unquote Negro nationalism is gone, of the Pan-Africanism of the diaspora and the Pan-Africanism of the continent. This made it clear that since the Pan-African identity was not grounded in a natural unity, it was something that, as I say, had to be built, not assumed. It was, as I was to argue later for national identity, not a fate, but a choice. A third line of objection has come more recently from those who see in the new genomics a way of reinstalling a biological notion of race for scientific purposes. People often mention here a famous paper by Noah Rosenberg and his colleagues that used an algorithm called structure to partition human beings into 377, to partition human beings using genotypes at 377 autosomal microsatellite loci in 1056 individuals for 52 populations. That last phrase is a quote from the abstract for the paper. So it turned out that the best clustering of these people using structure was into 5 groups, which corresponded roughly to African, Amerindian, East Asian, European, and Melanesian origins. But as they pointed out, within population differences among individuals account for 93 to 95% of genetic variation. Differences among major groups constitute only 3 to 5%. So even if there is a biological for this system of classification, and even if most, if not all people fit clearly into one of the 5 groups identified by programs like structure, there's a question about why we should be interested in this fact outside biology, given that by far the largest source of biological variation between people is within populations, not across them. The point of the race concept originally in everyday life was to be usable to help us to tell interesting things about the different groups. But if most of the interesting differences between people aren't, if most of the interesting differences between people occur within those populations, and if lots of the interesting differences between people aren't biological, we don't really need the concept of race outside biology, even if genomics and algorithms like structure give us reason for reintroducing something like it, a statistical notion, something like it, for the purposes of thinking about the statistical structure of human biological differences. So again, so it seems to me, the conceptual engineer's focus on the question, better for what, helps us to see what's what here. And one more point to make about the conceptual engineering point of view's utility in thinking about how we redesign our talk about what we now call race. As Susan Gelman argued in her fascinating book, The Essential Child, evidence from developmental psychology shows that by the age of 6, children everywhere treat races as possessing inborn features inherent in the person and passed down from parent to child. Young children, she argues, also essentialize these groups. They believe that the outer characteristics by which they assign people to groups reflect shared inner properties that explain both appearance and behavior. It follows that any terms that we introduce into our language for kinds of people are likely to get essentialized by children. Now, of course, we can undo these habits by unteaching children these things they do naturally and spontaneously. What Sarah Jane Leslie has called a default mode of generalization can be undone with effort. That's a generalization by generics. But to the extent that we think it useful for some human purposes to have rough and ready ways of classifying people, this psychological essentialism poses a design problem. For one of the features of race talk that I have objected to is that it makes people expect those of one race to be more like each other and less like members of other races than they actually are for most important human purposes. So essentialism of this sort will often lead you astray epistemically, not just morally, as it does because of our tendency to use kinds of people. It leads you astray morally because because we have a tendency to use kinds of people as the basis for in-group versus out-group hostility. There are costs of the concept of race, even understood, as I'm now inclined to think of it for social purposes, as a racial identity, according to an account of identity that I've sketched most recently in my book, The Lies That Bind. The conceptual engineering of race as a kind of racial identity is useful for understanding how race works in our ethical lives, as I argued in the ethics of identity earlier. Its explicit location of race among identities in that book, identities like nationality and gender and so on, reduces the temptation to think of the categories as made by science rather than history. But it carries the risk of essentialism that comes with any kind of identity term, psychological essentialism of the sort that Gelman is talking about. So it has epistemic costs as well as whatever benefits it has. So as always, against the costs of race talk, we must array any potential benefits. Engineering is about costs and benefits in a specific range of contexts for a specific task. This is what it is to think of this as a design problem. So let me finish this part by briefly considering why I'm skeptical about the value of one of the most widely proposed benefits of keeping on with race talk. Doctors, enthusiasts for racial categories will tell you, need to classify people into groups of common ancestry to know what to look for, because there are true generalizations about the racial distribution of diseases. Take, they will give as their favorite example, sickle cell disease and Black people. Well, all right, let's take sickle cell disease. The normal hemoglobin molecule is made up of 4 subunits, 2 alpha and 2 beta chains, helices. Each chain is produced by a distinct gene, and there are many variants of both the alpha and the beta chains. Since the alpha and beta chains are required in equal numbers to form normal hemoglobin, there's also a range of genetic diseases associated with non-standard hemoglobins, the thalassemias, in which one or other chain is produced in too small a quantity, for example. 39% of Nigerians have some form of alpha thalassemia, the disease produced when you have an underproduction of alpha chains. These disorders, sickle cell and other thalassemias, can be inherited both separately and together, producing a dazzling array of blood diseases. And so there's a very wide range of clinical contexts in which it's relevant to know if someone has Nigerian ancestry. Why are these genes common in Nigeria? Well, because it's a place where there's lots of malaria. And these variations in hemoglobin help you adapt to malaria, since the shape of the red blood cell makes life for the malaria parasite harder. So that's why the thalassemias are especially common in the Mediterranean and the South Pacific as well, where there's malaria, though not in the New Guinea highlands, where the altitude makes malaria and mosquitoes infrequent. Of course, it's the differences in frequency between populations that make these correlations significant. As a standard discussion of blood diseases puts it, alpha thalassemia is perhaps the most common single gene disorder in the world. The frequency of alpha thalassemia alleles is 5 to 10% in persons from the Mediterranean basin, 20 to 30% in portions of West Africa, and as high as 68% in the Southwest Pacific. The frequency of heterozygote carrier status among the Chinese population has been reported to vary from 5 to 15%. The frequency of alpha thalassemia is less than 0.1% in Great Britain, Iceland, and Japan. I'm betting that those 5 to 15% in the Chinese population are mostly concentrated in the tropical and subtropical areas of China, since you're not going to get malaria in the colder parts. All right, so 25% of the population of Nigeria as a whole carries the gene for hemoglobin S, the disease which produces the classic and serious form of sickle disease in heterozygotes. But the frequency of sickle cell trait in the African-American population is around 1 in 13, or between 7 and 8%, because many of the ancestors of the African-American population came from non-malarious areas of the world, including non-malarious areas of Africa, though of course the African-American population has European, Asian, and American ancestry as well, since it's a mixed population. But sickling is also found in 2% of Sicilians, and there are many Sicilians in the United States, people of Sicilian ancestry, and in some parts, some villages in Sicily, it's as high as 13%. And it's found in Hispanic, South Asian, and Middle Eastern groups as well. Given that there's now a simple test for hemoglobin S that is in fact given to every child in America at birth, it is not a good example of the characteristic for which racial information is needed in the United States. And it can mislead, because if you've got your doctors only looking for sickle cell in Black people, they won't look for it in people of African ancestry who don't look Black, and there's a lot of those, and they won't look for it in people from other parts of the world. Now, I've gone through this example because the conceptual engineering point of view explains why all this is relevant to thinking about whether, when, and how to use the word race for the purposes of medical diagnosis and analysis and treatment. Okay, that's the end of part 3. This is my coda. Kevin Sharp reminded me the other day that when some years ago I was asked to write 100 words on my conception of philosophy, my answer began like this. My answer was a 100-word poem. Let me be clear, thinking things through is tough. You need the proper concepts rightly understood, and no one working on their own will be enough. It takes a crowd of minds working together. I didn't then realize that the reason I thought all of this was that just as Molière's bourgeois gentilhomme was speaking prose long before his tutor drew the fact to his attention, I've been doing philosophy of race as a kind of conceptual engineering all along. But recognizing that is a big step forward. It allows you an explanation of one of the central features of the debates in the philosophy of race. People are aiming to do different things when they think of mapping the race concept. They have different implicit desiderata, different, as it were, design specification. That encourages, once you see it, pluralism about proposals, a pluralism I've always endorsed. In my first papers on this matter, I said that if biologists had a use for race, that was fine. Trying to make desiderata explicit can allow us to see that different proposals have different virtues, that they achieve a variety of aims to differing degrees. If you share all the aims, you can think that in some contexts, one notion is useful, in others. But this does not mean that anything goes. Some ways of doing things really are worse, all things considered, than others, given certain purposes. So there are better and worse conceptual engineerings of race. Thank you.